Hi,
my friend.
my friend and partner. And today we have another partner, the very, very special guest.
We're very, very glad to have
and
you
deeply
here,
honored
Hilary.
to have here with us today Hilary Bricken from Harris Bricken. You know what we mean? Harris Bricken, Hilary Bricken, partner named partner at Harris Bricken. And I want to give us a brief bio of Hilary so you all know her. But first of all, Hilary, let me greet you and thank you for being here with us. As I was saying off camera, we're very, very honored and grateful that you accepted this invitation. And it's incredible to have you here in our forum as you had us as guests in yours a couple of times.
Likewise, I'm very glad to be here and to have a very nice conversation about this exciting precipice in international cannabis law between the US and Mexico. It's an exciting time to be in the area, that's for sure.
Great.
A rock star of the legal cannabis industry.
A rock star of the legal cannabis industry. Okay, Hilary Bricken is a partner at Harris Bricken in its Los Angeles office. She's licensed to practice law in California, Washington, and Florida. She is one of the premier cannabis business and regulatory attorneys in the United States. As chair of Harris Bricken's Regulated Substances Practice Group, she helps cannabis companies of all sizes with their cannabis-related business and regulatory needs. Hilary, once again, thanks for being here. You're very, very welcome. And we want to start, Hilary. We were saying off camera that there's a lot of questions in the potential Mexican partners that look up to the United States, looking for investors, looking for partnerships, and Mexican citizens, Mexican potential partners really want to know what are the main concerns of their potential US partners. Can we start there? Can you tell us what a US potential partner is looking for and what are his concerns in regards of Mexican cannabis soon to be fully legal market?
That is a fantastic place to start. And I will tell the audience, I do a lot of foreign direct investment work. I do a lot of mergers and acquisitions, transactional work, and corporate governance in the cannabis industry, predominantly in the United States, in those states in which I am licensed. And just from the very high level view, in the United States...
I'm sorry, Hilary, can you get a little bit closer to your mic?
Yes. Is that any better?
There you go. Thank you.
Just so that the audience understands, and maybe some of my colleagues have already visited this issue, but a US cannabis investor is very used to a certain set of regulations and state laws with this backdrop of federal illegality. They are meticulous and very careful when they look at cannabis partners as a result, whether it's in the United States or abroad, because they understand that compliance is key to success. And no matter where you are in the world, cannabis is heavily regulated because it's a commodity and because there's an existing illegal market. Plus, there's the desire of federal governments and state governments, municipalities and provinces to create tax revenue. So compliance is extremely important to a US investor. Their main concerns in looking at a Mexican cannabis business from the top down, number one, does your operational team, the team that will perform the day-to-day functions of the cannabis business, have competence in the area? Lots has changed for cannabis in the past decade. It does not sell itself, and especially in a market like Mexico, where adult use maybe is a few months away, hopefully sooner than that, but we have essentially a pharmaceutical grade type product that's going to be dispensed in Mexico. So a US investor will look at the executive team and try to determine, does this team have competency in the areas of drug making, pharmaceutical sales, distribution, medical integrity? And those are very difficult, frankly, talents and competencies to come by without sufficient training. So they're going to look at education and experience. They're definitely going to look at your resume. And on top of that, lots of US investors, whether they mean to do this or not, they will ask prospective partners, do you have criminal history? what does the criminal history look like? Because in the United States, we're used to basically openly violating federal law. And honestly, Mexican partners should not be offended if the US investor wants to run a background check. They want to know if you've been convicted or participated in major drug crimes, including trafficking. Can they trust you is really the question. Because most investors are going to want to be hands-off, they want to be passive, and while they want to have financial controls, they really don't want anything to do with the day-to-day running of the business. The other things that they're going to look for are the assets of the company, right? When we all make an investment, we look at what the company has that's of value or its liabilities. So things that will be important to a US investor are going to be location, and especially for dispensing in a pharmaceutical capacity. Are you close to patient populations and consumers that are going to drive traffic to the pharmacy or to the store? Are you an owner of your real estate? Are you leasing your real estate? Do you have a good relationship with your landlord? They will be concerned about that. The third big bucket that they want to know about is compliance. In the executive team, the day-to-day managers that are overseeing the operations, what is your compliance plan? And in the pharmaceutical world, this is not unusual, where we already have existing protocol dictated by federal law and state law regarding the dispensing of drugs, the storage of drugs, the tracking and tracing of drugs, and dealing with patients and privacy records. They're going to want to see all of that paper to determine whether or not you're in compliance.
Great. Okay, so, okay. I'm making notes. I'm actually making notes, Hilary, because this is a really initial of sorts with Hilary Bricken. So excuse me if I go from there to each and every specific detail that you just mentioned. For example, operational team and competence goes directly to knowledge. And we've heard once and again all throughout this summit that information is power and that information is the starting point of this industry. So competence, of course, goes directly into good manufacturing practices and growing techniques and all of that. But what about other kind of information? What would be the starting point for a legal team to where would be the starting point in order for a potential partner to look at, or what would be the particular piece of information that cannot be in a due diligence, it cannot be left out?
I would say most investors want to know what your financial projections look like, right? They're going to want to see a budget. And in Mexico, and this is a question for you guys, are there minimum financing requirements to participate once you get your license? In the States, certain states have liquidity requirements to participate. And this is extremely important. It's the first data point that investors look at because they want to know how much will this cost and what is the return on my investment in, let's say, 2 years, as we have a run-up to starting. They don't expect you to be profitable, but they definitely expect you to be wise in how you spend your capital. So in the Mexican market, as these regulations unfold on the medical side, do you anticipate that there will be a liquidity requirement, at least a minimum amount of capital to be able to get a license or start the business?
Okay, so here in Mexico, we don't expect there to be a liquidity requirement. Foreign investors will be able to come to Mexico and get as much money as they want, so to speak. We have, as of right now, because of the foreign investment law, we have a cap, a 49% cap, but only in those corporations that look forward to acquiring the land, for example, for the primary activities of the plant. But other than that, we don't have liquidity requirements, nor do we have, as of right now, maximum investment caps. And I think that's important for the U.S. market to know and to take into account, because we in one of the first documents about this federal cannabis federal law in Mexico, there was a 49 cap in any corporation. That has disappeared. So I think that's a good news for the foreign investment market. And well, there it is. There's no such caps as of that matter. And let me go to the criminal history. How big and how real is this fear of what we have or about the situation in Mexico in terms of security, in terms of feeling safe in regards to organized crime? Is that a big issue for the U.S. Potential partners?
Yeah. From the investors that I've spoken to and the cannabis companies, at least that we represent, that are eyeing foreign markets, actually physical safety has never once come up. I will tell you what their main concern is in participating, and they really believe, for better or worse, that this might be the case, but that the licensing program itself is going to be corrupt. And we have a lot of that going on in the United States with local governments and state governments, and who gets a license versus who does not in a given jurisdiction. And there are investigations all the time about conflicts of interest, breaches of fiduciary duties at the government level, where literally politicians are giving licenses to their personal friends, even though they have no competency in the area. And that's really caused a stir regarding trust of the programs. So many US actors, their initial question when entering into a market is, how stable is it? And is there going to be a healthy level of corruption from the top down? Because if so, it's probably not even worth participating. I would say that's the bigger concern over things like physical safety and other issues with organized crime that have gone down in the past. They really just want to know that they're going to get a fair shake at getting a license, and that they won't have to pay off a politician or have some kind of conflict of interest that compromises them and their ethics or their money in order to operate.
That's great. This takes me to the next question, because you mentioned a term, a fair shake, a fair treatment, as if they were locals, as if they were Mexicans. And we talked about in one of the webinars in the past few months about how in Mexico there will be a preference, so to speak, in regards to the landowners that are agricultural, that have an agricultural vocation, and that they will be in fact benefited amongst, above all others, above all other landowners. So I think that's something that we have to address. I mean, a partner that's coming from the US, or a potential investor that's coming from the US, as you said, will be looking for location. This is something that I want to put out there already, although I know you know, many of our listeners don't. The agricultures and the landowners that have been affected by our Mexican war on drugs are in fact going to be, for the next 3 to 5 years, will be benefited from these licenses. So that's something that they have to know, that our future partners have to know, but also our Mexican partners have to know. So if you are a landowner, a Mexican landowner, you have to take this into account, so that you make alliances with those landowners that have been affected by the war on drugs, because they in fact won't get a fair handshake. They will be benefited, and they will profit more between the first 3 to 5 years. So that's something to be taken into account. And this takes me to our next question, Hilary. What about does the ownership of the land, is it important? Is it really important for our partners, for our US partners to come to Mexico? I mean, do they want to become landowners themselves, or or is that not just a big deal for them? What's the way of doing business in the US in regards to the land?
In regards to real estate,
Yeah.
generally, it would be better for these individuals to own the land on which they operate. Why? Because most of these companies that are operational today in this startup landscape of cannabis, they're looking for big exits down the line. They want a big acquisition from a competitive entity after the fact, after they become established. And of course, owning the real estate is going to up the price tag on any valuation. Plus, investors really don't like unstable relationships between landlords and tenants that they cannot control, especially when they're a passive investor. It is better to own the real estate for a multitude of reasons, from taxes to just better operational control. But oftentimes, when they do mergers and acquisitions, investors are looking basically to sell on the basis of also owning the real estate in addition to various business assets.
So is it a fair assumption to say that investors will be looking for real estate and for landowners that are in a specific particular location? That's part of the profile that the future investors will be looking upon at Mexican or potential Mexican partners?
Yes, that's definitely a fair statement, that investors that are serious will be looking for those opportunities, and maybe they only want to own the land and later on try to acquire some shares or equity in the actual operator. But real estate is a very safe, attractive bet, and usually an initial play that's going to lead into a bigger opportunity down the road for the operator.
Okay, and that takes us to assets of the company. This takes us to our recent experience as counsel and assessors of these future businessmen and Mexican cannabis entrepreneurs. Most of them don't have real assets as of right now. I mean, they have ideas, and some of them have knowledge, but there's really not, there are not many Mexican companies or corporations that have assets other than maybe real estate. What kind of assets would a potential partner be looking at or be looking for here in Mexico? Is there a particular set of assets that Mexico can offer in this early stage of the industry?
Well, you mentioned ideas. Ideas are not bad. One of the primary assets that can be hugely valuable is intellectual property. So those ideas around product lines, trade dress, trade secrets, those can manifest into instant value as long as there's a market out there for that. And I assume with medical cannabis and eventually adult use cannabis, there's going to be a variety of audiences that are looking for established Mexican brands that are consistent, reliable, maybe based on potency. So that's an asset always that investors are looking for. The second one, customer lists and relationships with vendors, right? Strategic relationships across the chain of distribution. Some of them are going to be better than others. There are certain distributors, I'm sure already, that have a lot of power or that are building leverage. That's also going to be quite lucrative. And then just knowledge of the culture and knowledge of the consumer market and how to drive consumers into these pharmacies rather than other pharmacies, basically the competitive advantage. And these are all things that are not palpable. You can't buy them. It takes years of experience in knowing the market.
That's great. Okay, let's move to the federal level. I mean, we started to talk about this with Vincent. We talked about the future federal legalization in the US and about the future legalization here in Mexico. But we just talked about the general potential benefits of both nations going federal. In terms of businesses, what would this mean for a businessman in the US? What changes would he have to make or do with his structure in order for him to come to Mexico, maybe with products already? or with a specific line or with raw materials? And what would you already talked about supply chains and list of buyers. What else would be important for him to look at, and what changes would Mexico would have to do in order for him, for Mexico to accommodate those investments?
Well, I think off the bat, the main issue is import-export for those products. And once we have international commerce, because the federal prohibition will have dropped here, life is going to get a lot easier for people with established products that want to import them into Mexico. On top of that, intellectual property licensing agreements, which can be international. Right now, there's a lot domestically in the US from state to state because you have to have a license to operate within a given state. Not everybody wants to take the time or spend the money to get the operational license. So they just license their intellectual property to an operator within the state, right? So they may never touch cannabis a day in their life, but their IP is on the product. That can probably happen now without too much friction, but it will happen a whole lot more once we have federal legalization. And it'll be everything from celebrity branding to athletes to established brands for other consumer products in both markets. And as far as structure goes, I imagine that for any Mexican venture, the US businessman is going to want to start a completely new entity, probably based in Mexico, to keep it separate from the US assets. But it all depends on whether or not they want a big acquisition after the fact of this global portfolio or not. So a lot of it is just contingent on timing and context over when the US legalizes. But I want to be clear to everybody who's listening, there's no guarantee that the United States is going to legalize. Even though we have a Democratic controlled House, Senate, and White House, the estimate is that if we do legalize, it'll be sometime within the next 2 years. And it certainly will not happen overnight. The feds have a lot of work to do. But on top of that, the states are still probably going to control what the regulations look like. So any international dealing with an existing cannabis business in the US would have to deal with the federal framework and their state's framework. And the states could certainly take the position that they don't want any international investment coming in or out of their state. They have the power to do that. So it's unwritten what it's going to look like, but a lot of it will depend on the timing here more than anything.
Okay, you just said something that we repeat time and time again to any potential customer, to any potential client in Logic, which is investors want to be able to trust, and confidence is partly acquired in knowing your partner, but also confidence or trust is comes from being able to start fresh, because many Mexican stakeholders who already own a corporation, they would come to us and say, hey, can we modify the social object? Can we modify the bylaws so that we can accommodate a cannabis object and transform this into a new, not a new, but an old corporation that wants to get into cannabis business? You just pass it through very lightly. Would you care to elaborate in this? Why is it not a good idea to use an old corporation if you want to accommodate foreign investment? Why is it good for it to be brand new?
Solid question. The reason why you want a new entity almost entirely hinges around avoiding old liabilities. Because if you have an active entity that's been around for a decade in a different line of business, you are not going to want to mix it with a new line of business going forward that has a different set of obligations, duties, priorities, regulatory expectations, and legal compliance issues. And for example, in the States, this is super important because it's federally illegal. So for example, if you had an existing business, let's say it was a grocery store, you would not try to own your dispensary through the grocery store, because all of the liabilities of the dispensary would be imputed to the grocery store and vice versa. So liability avoidance is a very, very big aspect of that. Also, preservation of separate assets. We also want to keep assets separate from each other Yes, because of liabilities, but also because of organizational factors. You don't want to be mixing various vendor contracts between two very different lines of business. And this is also a reason why we have parents and subsidiaries and affiliates, to keep those lines of business separate, but to keep the organization and control unified at the top of the organizational chart. Okay. The other reason, the last reason why you want a new entity, is because of an M&A event or a liquidity event. If you want to sell, it's much easier to do it with the new entity because it's clean, maybe has a different operational history, has different liabilities and assets than the old company. Plus, at least in the United States, we have vertical integration.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Could you repeat that last third point, because we lost you between the volume that went down, but also because of some sort of distortion, maybe due to the Wi-Fi signal. That last point, I think it was very important.
Got it. The last reason to have the new entity, one of the last major reasons, is because of M&A, mergers and acquisitions, right? At least in cannabis in the United States, we have vertical integration prohibitions. So if you want to sell your dispensary and there's also a grow license attached to the dispensary, you cannot split off one of the licenses. You must sell the company that holds both of them. So you'd be better off having one company that holds the grow license, one company that owns the dispensary. And if you want to sell the dispensary, you sell the company that owns the dispensary, but not the company that holds the cultivation license. And that's pretty much ubiquitous across the globe, that licenses are not transferable, right? You can only buy or sell the equity in the companies that hold them. So if you want an exit, when I say exit, I mean sale of all of your equity for cash or stock of the acquirer, whatever, you probably want to have an individual entity that has its own operational history, that does not have a history of previous operation in a different line of business. Why? Again, because when the buyer runs due diligence, if they see any weird liabilities from the old entity, it could stop the sale, it could raise a bunch of questions. So M&A is just another reason why you want a separate, clean entity, new entity, when it comes to cannabis licensure.
I loved that you talked about verticality, because we had a prohibition of verticality in the first federal law project here in Mexico.
Not anymore. And also we thought at the very first time when we saw the regulation related to medical industry, that there were a provision about it, but not anymore. So
yeah,
and that's something that it will open very fully the industry in Mexico, which I think is terrific.
And the question in regards to verticality is, you have a provision of verticality in the US, but you don't have it here in Mexico. Do you think that plays an important role in future investors coming to Mexico? I mean, will they want to own in one big, fat, massive corporation all the licenses, all the permits, as do some companies in Canada? Or does the American way of things, a prohibition of verticality, might be copied or brought to Mexico, although we don't have this prohibition?
Well, let's talk about why we have tied house rules on the state level. It's similar to alcohol in the United States, right? Where you can't own everything in the chain. You can own certain pieces, but not all of it. It's because of competition. And we don't want to build monopolies. We're very anti-monopoly in the United States on the whole. And that's why we have those rules in some states. Some states, you can be completely vertically integrated and you fend for yourself in the marketplace. Depending on the investor, they may want total verticality because they want control and consistency across the branding, all the way to the retail setting. Or it's going to be cost prohibitive and they only want certain pieces of the distribution cycle under their control. So I would say it's actually attractive that there's no verticality requirement in Mexico, because then investors can pick their price point over verticality. And sometimes you can't do that here in the US.
Hilary, you think that once it's everything open, the big guys, I mean, like Last week, I think it was Philip Morris acquired a really good percentage of the company, and we start seeing more this kind of decisions and these kind of investments. You think Mexico is going to suffer a little bit of that, a little bit of monopolization, a little bit of big guys sitting on the table and trying to take all the cake for them?
I do, because I think that's what big guys do. Water is wet. That's what they're gonna do. And when it comes to rulemaking, at least here in the US, I'm sure it's similar in Mexico, there's a lot of influence over the regulators, right? Basically, you lobby, you get the laws passed that you want that fit your business model or the rules. And the saying is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So all the little guys that can't afford to do this, the chances are high that they will not make it, because the big interests, the Altrias, the Philip Morrises, the Constellation Brands of the world, they will angle to make the laws the way that benefits them. So what does that mean? High expense, high compliance requirements, lots of safety and consistency that's super expensive. And they've done that with tobacco and alcohol and even pharma. So I think the big guys are going to try to do what they do and make the marketplace exclusive to them. And the little guys will have to band together to protect themselves and have a unified voice when rules are on the table to be made.
Okay, let's go a little bit more into that. So here in Mexico, we have anti-competence law. And of course, the US has them. It's in their culture, in your culture.
Do we have?
Yes, we do. We have a competence committee. The thing is, when they come to Mexico, the big guys, as we're calling them, they of course will have a massive amount of power on the end of market share, because they're the big ones, and because the market at the beginning will be very, very small. Do you expect the US government to get into that, to regulate any of that free competence thing? I mean,
She already answered.
no, but I mean, they do in the US. But what about when they come to Mexico? Yeah, I want to hear. I mean, okay, let's say US government gets into other countries because of many reasons. Yeah, but what about competence or market share? Would the US government get their hands into those companies or try to stop them if they wanted to get a big share of Mexican market, which they could?
I'm not sure they would try to stop them if it was strictly a Mexico play. I will tell you, in the US, when there have been these larger mergers across what we call our multi-state operators, they're called MSOs, we have had second looks from the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, and the DOJ, the Department of Justice. What they're looking at is to make sure that the merger does not result in monopolistic behavior. They won't let them get too big in the United States. But for an international acquisition, I don't even know if they'd have the jurisdiction to stop them if the commerce wasn't taking place in the US. But they definitely have checked them in the gut to say, are you violating anti-Sherman laws? Are you violating monopoly laws? And that's good. They should be checking on those things, but they haven't stopped any of those mergers yet. They are watching though.
Okay, and this takes us to another federal regulated issue in the US. As of right now, we have the Hemp Act that's fully legal across the whole country in the US. And but then there's this federal provision of anything else. And here in Mexico, we might have a federal regulation in about a month. Could the potential investors from US get in trouble if they are stakeholders in legal-based corporations here in Mexico? I mean, would that play tricky or different for them?
The short answer is yes, and this is where we always run into trouble with foreign direct investment and immigration, by the way. And not that anybody is trying to immigrate one way or the other, but if you're trying to come to the US, Mexican, Canadian, Israeli, doesn't matter, and you're participating in the cannabis industry, including ancillary, like real estate or hardware or equipment, right? Basically, immigration can stop you because they will say you're aiding and abetting or conspiring to violate US laws about cannabis, even if you're coming from a country where it's legal. And we know this because a bunch of Canadians were blacklisted and they were stopped from crossing the border a couple of years ago because immigration in the US is so aggressive about this. And it's the same thing with customs. If you're trying to import Mexican product into the United States, it will absolutely get stopped and seized at the border because we do not acknowledge legalization in other countries. So for foreign investors, when they invest in a country where cannabis is legal, when they try to bring the money back, they potentially have huge problems because under federal law, technically, it's going to be money laundering that violates the Bank Secrecy Act.
Yeah.
That's a big no-no in the United States. And the guidance that we have in the US for financial institutions that assist cannabis companies does not extend to individual investors. So this is a huge risk spectrum for our foreign direct investment in other countries. You really are playing with fire when it comes to DOJ enforcement, Treasury enforcement, taxes with the IRS, because technically under our laws, even if it's legal in your country, cannabis is federally illegal, and we do not acknowledge its legality in other countries.
Okay, so explain something to us. Throughout the webinars, many questions were raised, and most of them came from entrepreneurs or businessmen, cannabis businessmen that are already operating in the US and that want to come to Mexico. So explain that to us. I mean, are they just temerary? Are they brave? Are they just, are they businessmen and so they want to make money? Because the questions were not, the questions were, what can I do in Mexico legally? But they weren't, or they didn't seem too concerned about this issue. And do they don't know? Should we as Mexicans or potential Mexican partners tell them, hey, have you thought about how are you going to take your revenue back to the US? Is that an issue that we as Mexicans should be addressing with our potential partners if they don't raise the question in the negotiations?
So you have hit on something so important. I don't know anything about securities laws in Mexico and raising money, but most companies will go out and they'll raise money to get started. They can't do it themselves on a very small budget. When they do that, typically, unless there's an exemption, they have to tell investors what all the risks are from participating in the business. Mexican companies absolutely need to be telling foreign investors, you may have a problem in your home country by participating here. Now, they shouldn't be giving legal advice unless they're licensed to do that about the consequence of the investment, but they need to point out that this is not cut and dry in the United States because of our Controlled Substances Act and treaties that we have with countries regarding the illegality of cannabis that have not been amended or updated on our end. So they absolutely have to point that out as a risk factor. Now, the entrepreneurs that you were talking about that were inquiring further about business in Mexico, they are brave. They are putting their civil liberties at risk every day in the United States by operating in the cannabis industry, and their risk tolerance is super, super high. So the initial investors from the United States in the cannabis industry will probably be existing operators and investors that have already made investments in the space because they have a very high risk tolerance. Now, institutional investors, Silicon Valley money, big money, probably not yet.
Yes.
Probably not yet until we figure it out on this side of the aisle, because the consequences are real, even though the chances are low that there will be intervention or some kind of criminal case. No lawyer could say that such an investment is without risk in the United States regarding criminality. So what you're dealing with are very high risk tolerance individuals that are willing to continue to openly violate the law, even if it's just financially speaking, by investing in the Mexican market. And that's exactly what they do here in the United States.
I think you just gave us another of what we call the gold green
golden
thing,
ounce.
yeah, golden ounce of wisdom, because to speak frankly, we have attended as partners some foreign businessmen who want to come to Mexico, and this particular issue, as of right now, it wasn't brought up, not once. And we as Mexicans tend to believe that a foreign partner knows what he's doing when he's coming to Mexico. I mean, we do believe that, and so this piece of info is it's just great, as there are many others. So we have 4 minutes left. I want to give you some liberty, Hilary, as to how do you want to end this conversation? Is there a particular issue you think that should be addressed right now that cannot be unsaid? And if not, I have one more question in regards to the what I want to call the shared consultation that we have to give to the Mexican parties and to the US parties when they get into negotiations in the cannabis industry.
I only want to give one kernel of advice, because I think globally people think that the United States has a handle on cannabis because we're very large. California went in 1996 to have this great democratic experiment with medical cannabis. But when Mexican companies are pitching US investors and talking to US cannabis companies, do not be afraid to talk to them like little children, because they do not know what is happening in Mexico. They just do not know. And unless they are educated and told the risk factors, they simply will proceed in darkness because they want it to work so badly. And there's a lot of kind of delusional thinking around legalization and the success of cannabis and how easy it is to get in and you're going to make tons of money. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's very hard work, and people have to understand these concepts. So do not assume that any investor knows what is going on. Most of them have no clue what's going on, and this is kind of fun money for them, and they're not going to be hands-on. But the minute there's a problem, they will come looking to you, blaming you, saying, why didn't you tell me? And you never want to be on that end of the dialogue with the investor, ever. So treat them like little children.
That I agree with Guillermo Wolf. This is the golden ounce webinar so far, because one mistake in the legal construct, in the legal advice, in the legal prescriptions can take a whole business down years from when it started. So I want to address this right now because the audience believes that you didn't know and that we didn't tell you that there's a mic issue. She knows, we knew, and we had to take the risk for this session because we didn't want to lose the opportunity of having Hilary here, and there wouldn't have been another occasion to reschedule this meeting. We know that there's been a mic issue coming and going, but to be fair, we believe the recording, which we will have to repeat and listen to and again come to it, the issue will be resolved. So Hilary, thank you so much for being with us today and for giving us these insights. Let me just, before we finish, we started with Adrian and Mexican regulation in English, brought to you by Harris Bricken. Then we talked with Jonathan and Fred about corporations and particularly intellectual property.
Yeah.
Then we have Vincent, who gave us the general view of the federal legalization. And then we finished as a great ending with Hilary, who gave us these pieces of info that are unmissable. I think this itinerary was enriching, to say the least. Once again, Hilary, it's been an honor to be able to share the mic and the video and this audience with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it. Sorry for the audio. I've leaned as close as I could without scaring everybody. I apologize. If anybody has follow-up questions, just let me know.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
So,
you
you
so
know,
much.
there she is, and she's opened herself to follow-up questions. Feel free to get them to us or to Adrian Cisneros. You have him, and he'll bring them to them. Thanks again, Hilary. Thanks
Thank you,
to everyone.
Hilary.
See you in the next session.
Thanks so much. Ciao.
Ciao.